Hello and welcome to today's episode of the DEI is podcast. So you might be, excuse me, let me back up. This is your host and community engagement lead to DiVerity's consultant network, Enrico Imanalo, coming to you live from the Bay Area. The DEI is podcast is written and created by DEI practitioners for DEI practitioners and the organizations that look for them. If you need help with your people and culture problems, come check us out at DiVerity.com to see if we're the community you're looking for. So today's episode on June 29th and June 20th, June 29th and June 30th, excuse me, the Supreme Court of the United States made a trio of rulings on affirmative action, student loans, and religion, free speech, and gay rights, which meant that moving forward, race could not be used as a factor in admissions, student loan debt will not be forgiven, and that despite a state law prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation, free speech is going to trump that. So, what does this all mean for DEI and social justice in higher ed and the workplace moving forward? With me today to talk about that very thing are Dr. Cornell Verdeja-Woodson, founder and principal of Brave Trainings LLC, and also now head of DEI at Zillow. Here with us as well are Dani Herrera, creator of the great content you can follow on LinkedIn, IG, and more by following the hashtag DEI by Dani, and Jake Small of Leadership Brainery, Inc., who also has his own consulting firm or practice, excuse me. How are you all doing today?
Amazing.
Oh, great.
Doing awesome. Really happy to be here.
All right. Well, so excited to crack in with all of you. Before we do that, let's pivot very quickly to our audience. So the question that we've got for you today is, what's one question that the recent SCOTUS rulings have surfaced for you? All right, so I'm going to leave that up for a little bit as we get into our first question. So what do the recent SCOTUS rulings mean for higher education? Let's start by clearly articulating what affirmative action is and what it isn't, because there's a lot of misinformation and many misconceptions out there.
For sure, I'll jump in. Hey everyone, this is Jake. He, him, his pronouns. So happy to be here. Affirmative action. I speak as not a legal scholar, not a person who's studied the law or practiced the law, but instead as a higher education professional for several years now, a nonprofit leader, but also as a monoracial Black person who was once a student, both undergrad and graduate school, as an openly queer person, as a person with overlapping and intersecting identities. Affirmative action within the college context, within college admissions, was a practice or policy that favored folks in terms of their undergraduate admissions into selective institutions. I think it's also important to recognize that affirmative action was in place across the nation, but the institutions who used it the most in their policies, use it the most in their practices, tended to be more selective institutions to try to build a diverse class. And as we've all been grappling with the rulings coming out of SCOTUS, I think we've also heard a lot of information, some of it really true, some of it not as true. And so hopefully we can bring some clarity to the decisions today as we talk about the impacts and the effects on the workplace and in higher ed.
Thoughts, Dani or Cornell?
I've been out of higher ed for quite some time, so I'm going to leave the higher ed context to the professionals there.
And adding to that, I think I'm probably the odd one here because I actually dropped out of school twice, to be honest. But with that said, I agree with everything that Jack just mentioned. So yeah, let's see what else we can add to the conversation.
Yeah, I think what people have to also keep in mind is like this decision applies nationwide, right? But there are states that also they've already dropped affirmative action in higher education, right? So Cornell, you and I live in California, huge state, huge educational system. And the data is telling, right? So we see that it had a marked impact on admissions. And, in interviews with folks who were applying, it seems like there's a real perception that this move meant that they wouldn't even be considered, right? So it's not even a matter of like, once people are in the door, how are they going to be judged or evaluated? It can change behaviors before they even get to that stage, right? And I think that's one of the things that we really need to make sure that we're bringing into the conversation.
Absolutely.
So, you know, we're all people who have done DEI work professionally. It's something that we're all very passionate about. And of course, that's what this podcast is largely about. So what kind of impacts are we anticipating for the impacts of these SCOTUS rulings in the workplace?
Yeah, I think that's the part that I've been really passionate about as I work in the tech industry. I think the thing to recognize, and Kenji Yoshino and David Glasgow from NYU wrote an amazing article for Harvard Business Review on the implications of affirmative action within the workplace, recognizing that the efforts that we have in the workplace are not illegal, right? So I think that's something that really clear, is that when SCOTUS knocked down affirmative action, everyone jumped to the idea that, oh, now all those things that we do in the workplace to develop and create diverse workplaces are now illegal, and that's actually not true. What I argue, though, is that it does give those who wish to see DEIB efforts go away, it gives them a stronger foundation to now continue to sort of amp up their rants, their focus on knocking down DEIB efforts. In fact, I believe there was a number of attorney generals that wrote open letters to several CEOs, and I forget what states, saying basically, we're coming for you, and that you need to be mindful about this, given this thing. Now, there are some other attorney generals, mainly Black and brown people, who wrote another open letter saying, don't fall for it. So, like, we're already seeing it. We're already seeing how they're utilizing SCOTUS knocking down affirmative action to continue coming for the ways in which we try to build diverse workplaces. I think and I knew this was coming. I knew this would be it, because this is how the law is used. Ruth Bader Ginsburg took that case all those years ago because she knew that if I could get you to understand gender discrimination from this perspective, I could also get you to understand it from here. And it would be naive of us to think that the other side wouldn't also be trying to utilize it in the same exact way. And so I think we have to stay diligent. And I think that this will be an opportunity for us to really see which organizations and companies truly have a intrinsic motivation to see DEIB be advanced, rather than it be an opportunity for them to step away from it out of fear or out of true feelings that they didn't care in the first place.
Oh, that was great. Cornell, before we move on, sorry, just 1 second. We do have somebody with a question, right? Oh, sorry, that's not the right one. Oh, geez. Yes, it was that one. Excuse me. So Elena Joy Thurston is asking, can we clarify the difference between affirmative action in the workplace versus education? So Cornell already got at that a little bit, but is this conversation focused on one more than the other? I mean, so to answer that last part first, Elena, things are interconnected, right? So if there's an issue in higher education, that means that there's an issue for our workforce in the future, right? So I know that these things are presented as disconnected, and maybe they don't overlap so much. They might not overlap, but they grade into each other, right? So it's a spectrum of things. And so that's why if we're taking like systems or ecological perspectives, we really have to pay attention here. So anybody got some clarity around the major differences between affirmative action in, say, higher ed versus in the workplace? Because they are distinct.
Yeah, the one thing that I would add, so sorry, Jake. The one thing that I would add is, and this is something that I heard a lawyer actually talking about just yesterday, is that this ruling that we are seeing today is only and specifically for education. So if we are, as Cornell was saying just a couple of seconds ago, if we are now seeing organizations or companies like backtracking on their D&I efforts, they are doing that because they want to and not because they are being forced to, between a million air quotes, because of this ruling. Hopefully that brings a little bit more clarity as well.
Mm-hmm. Jake, you wanted to get in there?
Yeah, for sure. I'll also say that, because this, is definitely focused on colleges and college admission even more so at first. Like Enrico, you were mentioning, it has implications to the workforce at every level: senior management, internships, mid-level management, et cetera. But within higher education specifically, affirmative action was simply an admissions policy. But I think it's important to know what the intent was at the onset, right? It was not a policy put in place to right historical wrongs. This was not an act of reparation. This was not a Black and Hispanic and other racially minoritized folks have been historically mistreated, and so now we must make them more included or better treated. Instead, it was a policy put in place to increase diversity in education. And those things might sound the same, but they're different. There's distinctions, right? Diversity on college campuses helps everyone, right? Folks with racial or ethnic minority identities, folks who are white or have privileged racial or ethnic identities. Everyone learns better in environments that are diverse. Diverse in terms of race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, generational relationships with higher education, right? We all learn better in spaces that are diverse. There have been hundreds of studies on that. And so affirmative action was put in place to ensure that our spaces were diverse. And also affirmative action was never enough as a standalone policy. It was never enough, right? Especially at the highest levels of education. So Leadership Brainery, the nonprofit that I currently am supporting, is focused on increased access to graduate school, recognizing there are so many careers out there that either require or prefer a master's degree or higher. And if you look at, for example, the years between 1978 and 2018, over those 40 years, while affirmative action was in place, we saw a decrease in the number of Black men, for example, in med school. We also saw widening access gaps at every level and in every industry of education. And so while affirmative action was great and did a lot of amazing steps, helps us make strides towards inclusion on college campuses, it wasn't enough, right? And to see it struck down before we even have something in place to continue that work is, of course, discouraging.
And I think you make a really good point, Jake, because one of the things I want to talk about often, and I think is missing from the conversation around DEI in general, is that extrinsic motivators are not ever going to sustain our efforts to actually right wrongs, right? So if I had to put a policy in place in order to get people to act right and do better, like already I would argue we're not doing the job, right? Yeah. Because the minute that policy is knocked down, and also policies are meant to, they can also be, violated, right? Like there are companies out here that are willing to pay that, $500,000 fine, $1 million fine when they, feel the way they feel. I think we need to really shift our focus on building intrinsic motivations for wanting to right the wrongs, right? Because then when everything else falls, the internal desire to see people not just survive, but thrive maintains. The last thing I'll say before I let you move on, Enrico, is that I think the other way in which this affirmative action actually knocking it down impacts the workplaces now as higher education gets less and less diverse over the years, moving forward, so will our ability to develop diverse teams. So that is even more detrimental for areas that were already very lacking diversity in terms of gender and racial engineering, right? Like we struggle with that in a major way. We're going to continue to struggle even more because now we have institutions that aren't allowed to utilize this resource to be able to build. But the question becomes, how do we do it even without that? Because we shouldn't need a policy in order to develop more diverse classes and campuses.
Yeah, there's so much in this topic, and so I'm glad that we have some space to talk about it. But your point about intrinsic motivation is, I think, so on point, right? So there's many cases that we talk about in diversity work. We talk about the business case, we talk about the moral case. But the fact of the matter is, if we're not weaving diversity into every aspect of what we're doing, it's always going to feel like extra work. And if there's something I know about extra work, even that phrasing, it's like, de-energizing me, right? So nobody wants to do extra work on top of the work that they're already doing. So it's really more of a mind shift than anything that we're after. But it's slow going. It's a long process. But what I can say is, from my perspective, the fact that there are these reactions in public and in the legal sphere is an indication that it's a large enough movement that people are really paying attention, which I think is no secret. So to pivot back to our audience here very quickly, how are the SCOTUS rulings impacting your life? So I'll leave that up as we move into our next question area. We know that higher education is where the majority of workplaces source talent. So in your view, like, let's say that organizations are out there, they have that intrinsic motivation toward to continue to diversify their workforce, as Dr. Verdeja-Woodson was just talking about. But what is it that they could potentially do to lead the push we've seen for greater DEI in the workplace, and more broadly, that push for social justice in the wake of these SCOTUS rulings?
I'll jump in there. I mean, this is a big part of what I do, and what we all do, really. But I think one of the things that is one is it's not easy, because I think oftentimes people do not see themselves in this work, and this is primarily, I'm just going to say, white heterosexual cisgender men, right, who come from a large body of privilege, right? They don't see themselves in this work. They don't see the personal value. They don't see the value of it at all, right? And so I think that in order for, and I actually did my dissertation on this, where I studied the motivation of white heterosexual cisgender men to become DEI advocates, and consistently across everyone within my study, they had the intrinsic motivation to do so, meaning that they understood how this benefit not only the business and the company and organization which they worked for, but they also understood why it mattered to them. And I think, Jake, you were talking about how, like, everyone benefits from being surrounded by difference and being able to engage across difference. And they understood that wholeheartedly from a value perspective, that I too benefit from being able to learn from my female counterparts, to be able to learn from trans people, to be able to learn from people of different races, and how that makes my life better. So there has to be the, what we call WIFM, what's in it for me, right? What is my stake in this, which drives the same thing we do within organizations. And we involve our executive leaders in the development of our DIB goals, not necessarily because we need them to, but because we know that when you have a stake in the game, you want to see that succeed because you were a part of developing it. Your name is on that. I think that's a part of how we begin developing that intrinsic motivation, is what is the benefit to you, and what do you stand to lose and gain if we do or don't advance these efforts.
Thank you so much for going much deeper into that. We did have a couple questions from, like, Elena and I believe Tamikia. I hope I'm saying that correctly, but just to expand on what that means, to expand or to increase intrinsic motivation, right? So another way, like, you might hear DEI folks talking about getting buy-in and things like that. Like, that's what we mean. Like, buy-in is intrinsic motivation, right? Let's see, we've got one comment coming in. So Quentin Foster says, for me, it's just one more anti-diversity decision that is bringing us backwards in time. Add this on top of all the anti-trans laws this year, on top of the racist practices we see used in every field and every state of the USA. I'm finding myself struggling to see the gains and positivity, because there is such an overwhelming amount of terrifying backwards movement. Quentin, thank you for allowing that peek inside of how you're processing these things, and thank you for adding to the conversation. Anybody got some kind of response for Quentin here?
I don't know if an actual response, but this is also the feeling that I'm getting from, like, my corporate, like, clients and the people that I'm, like, working with, either like as a speaker or like a consultant. They might not necessarily today be, like, super worried about what's happening at the education level, because the companies that I usually work with, they might not be, like, recruiting talent, like, fresh out of school. So they may not necessarily see the implications of what's happening today. they might start worrying about it in 2 or 3 years from now, or maybe like a decade from now. But this is something that is very fresh in their minds. Like, we are all seeing it happen. Like, a lot of them are pulling their D&I budgets, they're pausing their strategies, they're either removing their D&I teams completely, they're letting them go, they're pushing their strategies for next year. So that's something that I'm actually seeing, and I think that everybody on this call is seeing as well. I don't necessarily have an a definite answer of what's going to happen. I think that one of the things that I would like to see happening is the companies, as Cornell was saying, that the companies that are like fully intentionally about doing this work, what they might start doing is like shifting their focus and shifting their commitment a little bit. But I don't necessarily know if they're going to be like super open about it. So maybe that's another piece of the conversation that we might need to start thinking about. Maybe again, maybe not, that's not something that we are going to see like in the next rest of the year, the next couple of months, but it's something that I'm personally worried about, to be completely honest.
In terms of companies being public about what they're doing and what the
exactly.
goals are.
Yeah.
And,
I'll
and
agree
just,
that we won't see the full impacts. We won't realize the full impacts of the Supreme Court decisions for several years or even several decades. Yeah. Right, like that is just true. And like Dani was mentioning, we need to be proactive. We need to be forward thinking. I think the easiest way for people to do that is to think about the future that you want to live in. Think about the reality that you want to exist in. What's the vision that would make you feel the most comfortable? And for me, again, as a monoracial Black young person, young professional, I want to be able to live in any city in America and know that I can find a Black doctor, a Black lawyer if I need representation, a Black dentist, a Black therapist. How do we do that, right? So I have this beautiful vision of utopia in my future where Black folks specifically are at the highest levels of leadership and are in really impactful careers. To do that, folks need access to grad school. To do that, folks need access to undergrad. To do that, folks need access to a K through 12 pipeline that is strong and secure, right? For public schools, private schools, charter schools across the entire nation, right? So to get to the visions that we want, we need to know that there are steps we need to take. Right. And a lot of that's around education, especially as we look at the SCOTUS decision around affirmative action, and to realize the future that we want to see, whatever that might be for you as a listener or as an audience member. We need to take steps today to ensure that we're getting there.
Yeah. And just to go back to Quentin's sort of space of vulnerability there, and which I really appreciate, because I feel that way too. I feel like we're going so backwards. It's not even funny. And there are times where I'll be honest, it's hard to get out of bed. It's hard to come sit at this computer and do this work, knowing that it feels like it's all for naught. But what I know for sure, Quentin, one is that you're not alone. And two, that this is exactly what the system wants us to do. This is exactly what the system wants us to feel. They want us to feel like there's no hope, that there's no possibility, and hopes that we will just give up and not do it. And what we cannot do is ever give up. If anything, now more than ever, we have to find our community and stand together across groups, right? Like across groups, intersectionally, to really show up, because we are truly better together. And so I know that sounds like, like Nike, just do it, right? But the reality of it is that we have to amp up our community-based strategies and how we join together to fight back, but we can never give up, because that's exactly what they want us to do. And I refuse to let them win. And that's what motivates me to keep fighting, because that's what our ancestors did. That's what Marsha P. Johnson did. That's what MLK and Malcolm X, Audre Lorde, all of them, all the people who came before us, they kept fighting. And I'm sure they felt in times the very same way. So hang in there and definitely keep it up.
Thank you all for responding to Quentin. Oh, go ahead, Dani.
No, something very quick. Cornell, you actually bring like a very, very important topic, because I don't know if you all remember, like maybe like 2 or 3 weeks ago, like immediately after this decision, there was rise again on anti-Asian rhetoric again, and that's something that I've also seen within the D&I community too. So that's something that we need to keep in mind as we have these conversations as well, because as Cornell was saying, this is a fight that, I mean, we're all in it. It's not us versus them. I mean, it's something that we all need to work towards again.
Absolutely. I mean, I think also one of the things that I'm aware of is, especially here in the US, we have this idea in our minds, and it's a cultural idea of infinite progress, right? And we're used to seeing data displays that show like steady increases over time. That's not reality, right? So the way that progress happens is you advance a little, you go back a little, right? It's like waves lapping at the shore. And it's exactly that lapping motion that reduces huge boulders and rocks down to very fine sand, right? And that takes a very, 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 very long time to happen, but it happens. And we have the evidence of it everywhere around us, right? So if we have this idea that this is a steady march of progress and it's always one foot in front of the other, and incrementally year by year, we're just steadily going to move that line forward, let's disillusion ourselves of that fact right now, because that's not how it happens, right? We saw after the civil rights movement, there's an enormous backlash, right? And things didn't happen at the same level for decades, right? It's only recently that anything's even started to approach that. So there are major setbacks, but there have also been major advances. All right, so my colleague Janine is popping in here, says one way to bring positivity into our industry is recognizing that there has been a large amount of work that has been done over the past 2 years. The policies can't undo the awareness that people have now or undo the changed minds of the individuals who have done the work. And I think that's worth keeping in mind, right? That's something invisible. It's something intangible. It's something we don't have great numbers on, but attitudes have shifted. It might seem like a little, and it may be a little, but it's not nothing, right? So there's that.
Enrico, thanks for bringing up that point. If I could jump in for just a moment.
Please.
I think, I really appreciate that. It reminds me of MLK Jr.'s quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice," right? Of course, things take time, change takes time. I think we also need to strike a balance, of course, right? As we're working towards progress over decades or centuries, I think there are also things that need to happen today, right? So incrementalism in some ways can be used or weaponized as a product of white supremacy culture. And so some things need to happen, right? Like if folks are unhoused and we have empty homes, we need to get them housed. If folks are unfed and we have food going into trash bins every day, they need to be fed. If students need to get into school so they have access to high wages and high impact careers, and we can do that today. And there are seats in every institution for Black and brown young people. And let's do that today. And so that balance between incremental work and immediate abolitionism, right, is what we need to find and what we need to achieve, because what can change today should change today, while we are all consistently working towards a comprehensive and improved future.
I love that reminder. Like something that I often think about in this work is those Stephen Covey's circle of action, circle of concern. So it's like we've got this huge circle all around us of all the stuff in the world that we are concerned with, right? But that sphere is much larger than we can have a direct impact on. Smaller sphere within that is our circle of influence. So things that we can exert some change over, but maybe not directly. The smallest circle is our circle of action. That's what we can have direct impact on today, as Jake's talking about. Now, the fascinating thing is once you link up with others who have similar goals, then collectively your circle of action expands, right? So it fills up that circle of influence, and that circle of influence also expands your circle of concern. So one way to think about all of this is like when we're feeling isolated and alone is, well, we got 4 people up here who are like all about DEI. We've got who knows how many people tuning in to watch this that are also interested in DEI. So to me, the call is clear. We got to organize, right? And it doesn't have to look like the way that people organized in the past. And in fact, it already doesn't, right? So that's just one thing to keep in mind as well. So if we're moving into our next kind of question area, like beyond talking the talk of DEI, what can organizations do to lead if they're really committed to following the SCOTUS ruling on student loan debt forgiveness, right? So it's no coincidence that these three decisions come out all at once. And I mean, if you were being highly suspicious of these moves, then I think one could easily construe them as a concerted effort to target many different folks in the same category, broad category, in an attempt to divide, right? So starting little fires that people have to put out, and then they get distracted from the main kind of point. So, once again, what can organizations do, right? Student loan payments are set to resume in, I think, October, but interest is set to resume in September. So, thoughts here?
Pay people equitably, right? Like, when that when people are in crippling debt, and have worked hard to do the thing that we've all been told that we were supposed to do, which was get a degree and go to school. And if you just, earn your degree, then you'll be fine. And you too can have the American dream. And now we're in hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And it's like, I think the thing that organizations can do is conduct regular pay equity studies, ensure that they are paying people fairly, so that people can afford to not just survive, but thrive and be able to sort of get out of this debt as well. And just one of the things that I think is really important that you just mentioned, Enrico, about sort of the effort to kind of pit us against each other. And I think that's exactly what this affirmative action thing was as well. They took the opportunity, and I'm talking about particularly how they use Asian identified individuals as sort of the foundation of this argument, and kind of as an attempt, I would argue, to pit up particularly Black and brown people against Asian people, right?
Yep.
And I think we have to pay attention to that and not be fooled by the idea that, exactly what they're trying to make us do is fight each other and think that all Asian people hate us and we hate them, things of that sort, and recognizing what it is, and not fall for it and do the work of white supremacy, right? Because that's what we end up doing. We end up focusing on the wrong thing versus focusing on the actual root of the problem, which is white supremacy within the US and globally, quite frankly.
And within ourselves too, right? Cornell, I think that it's important to realize that nothing is as simple as good or bad, this or that, right? Incredibly well-intended folks can unintentionally perpetuate systems of white supremacy culture. And so we have to be reflective on who we are and what we want to do as well, and how we can show up. And coming back to the point around student loan debt, Enrico, it was, I think, 2013 or 2014 when America hit the $1 trillion problem, when our student loan debt collectively reached $1 trillion. And now we're only 10 years later, and we're at, I think, 1.7 or 1.8 trillion dollars. So, this issue is huge. And we know that it's not just an individual issue, it's a systemic issue, a combination of things. Some of it is colleges cost too much. Some of it is, like Cornell was saying, people aren't paid enough money, right? And so all of these different solutions need, or rather, all these different problems need solutions that are as dynamic and as woven as the problems are, right? And so our response needs to be as systemic, as structural, and it can't just be an individual saying, "Oh yeah, well I did it, someone else can do it," or "I'm gonna set up this plan to pay off my debt." No, there's a systemic issue here, and that's why we're experiencing.
What? Bootstraps are not going to fix our problem, Jake? What? I can't believe this. Let me write this down.
Who would have known?
And Enrico, if I may, because as you know, like, I'm very process oriented, and going back to what companies can do. I have maybe 3 things that we can probably help companies to implement. So first and foremost, if we are hiring talent that comes directly from school, or they're still studying and they're doing internship programs, pay your interns. That's as easy as it gets. I'm even surprised that I still have to say this, but there's so many companies that are not paying their interns, and it's absurd. The second thing is, unless it's absolutely necessary, we can still hold our internship program virtually, so interns don't necessarily have to move to a city where the office is, where of course it's extremely expensive to live just for a couple of months. So that's the other thing that we can do. And the third thing, companies usually have like learning and development programs, and they do have like learning stipends. So if there is a way for companies to actually like, you know, as an employee, you can request like to attend like a course as a certificate, and then they will give you a stipend to do that. Maybe there is a way for companies to give you a certain amount of money to actually like repay some part of your debt. Of course, it's not going to be like the full debt, but of course, some companies are already doing that. So maybe those are 3 things that we can start pushing a little bit more for.
Thank you so much for so clearly articulating those. And I'm sorry, did you want to jump in?
No, I was agreeing that, yeah, I think there are many companies that do offer some kind of support, you know, where they, you know, I know the company I work for, you know, pays a certain amount every month up towards my, you know, student loans. It's a small amount, but hey, every bit counts.
It adds up.
It really does add up. And I think the other thing to think about too, and this might be controversial, I don't know, but I'm gonna say it anyway because I don't care.
All right, let's go.
You also have to consider moving beyond the when we're hiring and selecting people. I'm thinking like 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, right? And consider that the college degree is not the only way in which people develop the skills and the knowledge they need to be really amazing employees. I'm gonna leave that right there. And
listen, it's not 40, 50 years from now. It's actually now.
Right now, right? But you know, so you know, how do we, you know, and I just think we have to really think about that. Like, what are the multitude of ways in which people develop the skills and, you know, who have an associate's degree only, right? But still have the skills, who went to a boot camp to learn how to code versus went to a 4-year institution. Like, I'm not saying any of it is bad, but if I chose that I couldn't afford to go to that 4-year institution, and I chose this other cheaper route that still gave me a quality education because I could afford it, am I also valuable to you as well? So I think that's another way in which corporations really have to kind of sort of look back and go, okay, how else are we hiring and expanding our worldview as ways for people to be viable options for us as high talent?
Right. And just to put not the finest point, but a finer point on what we're talking about, right? So it's no coincidence that a nation founded on slavery and white supremacy culture, of course, but also indentured servitude, is in a situation where many of its citizens are in debt, right? Like this was all predictable, frankly. So unless we're thinking of ways to not do that, we will continue to do that. Like, it's a cultural thing at this point, you know. I'm gonna turn to the comments real quick just to see if we've missed anything, because the chat is active, and thank you so much for all, you know, showing up, but also displaying all your energy and everything here. Let's see, Jessica Bantam had something that I wanted us to touch on, and she was saying, I'd love to see a site listing companies cutting DEI budgets and positions next to the statements they made in 2020. So I don't know if there are any website developers out there watching this, but hey, we got this hot new fresh idea for you. And I would certainly go to that website regularly. So Jessica, thank you so much for that idea. Let's see. Oh, yes. So I'm not sure how to say this name. I think it's Lorianne, maybe, but also for companies that already have higher education incentives like a stipend, they could reevaluate their policy to ensure it is still equitable for today versus when the policy was created. I think that's a great point, right? So many times we create policies and we just set it and forget it, but a policy is not a crock pot. Like, that's not what you do with policy. You got to update it. If you don't, it gets out of control. You know, like the Farm Bill is a great example out there in the world. But yeah, like part of this work is making sure that our stuff is current. And I know that's a pain. I know it's a slog, but we got to do it. We got to do it.
I just have to pause for a moment and say that I love that said that policies are not crock pots. It's an iterative process. It's not exactly. So what is
And let it sit there.
keeping the food analogy? What is policy and what is policy reform? I don't know. Maybe it's
Yeah.
salad.
Yeah.
Gotta use it, then get rid of it, try something new. I don't know.
This is a different website, still in development, but coming soon.
Exactly. There's a great comment in the chat about, the pay equity and sort of it going against current system of capitalism. And this is, I think Lee Show sort of mentioned this, and then Elena mentioned sort of, I can't leave with that because they'll be turned off by it. And I agree, right? Every organization has to be mindful. Every leader within an organization has to be mindful of how they pitch the ideas and the goal and vision to their organization, depending on where their leaders are from a mindset, right? So it's sort of what do you call it? Building that uniquely for your organization is absolutely critical. But I think the idea of always marching towards that is important. And I struggle with the idea that capitalism, though, and again, this may be another controversial thing too, because people disagree with me often about it. But I think that we oftentimes blame inanimate objects for why things are wrong versus the actual people who utilize them, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, because to say that capitalism in general is the problem means that we can't make money do good. That's what that feels like, right? Like,
yeah.
There are many businesses out there that do good and make money, right? And so I think to me, it's the problem is the way in which we use and engage in capitalism that is the problem. So how do we have a conversation around equitable capitalism that it still allows us to thrive and make money and go on trips and have our homes, but it doesn't mean that we have to literally crap on other people in order to do that. My thoughts, love to hear people's thoughts on that as well.
So just to lay down a little bit of foundation, because I am interested in following up on this, but capitalism is also not a monolith, right? Not all forms of capitalism are created equally. And in fact, the forms of capitalism that the United States, for example, engages in, there are two main flavors that are essentially iterations of each other, but the first is neoliberal economics, the other is neoconservative economics. And these are highly, highly, highly extractive. And they do leverage supply chains and globalism to ensure that the workforce is segmented and geographically distributed, which is to say it's very hard to create unions, right? You cannot create transnational unions at this time, I think. I don't know. Maybe if somebody knows, then please let me know. But the fact is, it's harder to organize and connect with people if you're not in the immediate vicinity, right? And this has been leveraged to an incredible degree, right? So when people are talking about jobs leaving the US, that part, yeah, that's true. It's not other people stealing their jobs. It's employers exporting jobs for their bottom line, right? That's not some other person's fault other than the person who's sitting behind the desk, like signing the papers and making the decisions, right? So to Cornell's point, I don't think that capitalism is inherently bad, but it does allow people to do lots of bad things much more easily. So the question again revolves around the people rather than the system. I think one question I'd like to ask our audience here is, let me find it here. If this trio of SCOTUS rulings had a theme song, what would it be? And I'm so interested in your responses. I will wait for those to come in. But moving into our like, if we're focusing on that last SCOTUS decision, right? So that ruling on religion, free speech, and LGBTQIA+ rights is on the minds of many DEI professionals. And that ruling essentially said that a web designer has a First Amendment right to refuse to create sites for same-sex weddings, despite a state law, and I think this was out of Colorado, prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation. So how do you all expect this ruling to impact higher ed in the workplace in the near term?
And it was all a lie.
It was all lies.
It was all a lie.
The person wasn't even real. The request wasn't even real. He made a federal
The guy was real. The guy was real, but he was that guy living with his family in a completely different state.
Yeah, and we just made a federal ruling on something that wasn't even real. But I think from a workplace standpoint, again, it's the same thing as knocking down affirmative action, right? It's like, what else will people use? How will people use this to build upon other ways to discriminate? For private companies, right, that are privately owned, will people start to think, oh, okay, well, if I don't want to hire certain populations because they cause problems or cause trouble, or they're not as qualified, or they make the code, whatever their excuse may be, will they start to use that? And I know that people may think, damn, Cornell, you're so cynical, but I think we have to think about the ways in which human beings operate. Right, like we got to think from a psychological standpoint of how people navigate the world, and if we're not thinking about the good and the bad, then I think we're not going to be truly prepared. So that's the only reason why my mind goes there. It's like, how will people use this to go, oh, now I can do this because I've always wanted to, right? They always wanted to. Yeah. So, it seems small, a little small website company, but like people will utilize that to make their own case for why they want to say, no, I don't want to do this and do that. So that's what keeps me up at night.
Yeah. So when, in those legal dramas and things where they're talking about precedent being set, it means that somebody did this thing before, so we can definitely do it again. Right. 100%. And so that's exactly what's happening now. So the fact that a federal ruling was made on a lie, that has huge implications, everybody. Mm-hmm. So we're getting some responses on that. Go ahead, Jake.
And I would definitely love to hear what folks on this call in the audience and then afterwards are thinking as well. I know that many courts with a more left-leaning makeup have used preemptive legal strategies to make cases. And so, I think it's important to recognize that while I am not in agreement with what this ruling means for our society, it is important for us to be able to safeguard legislation being built based on preemptive concern. Because I know that for me, like I oftentimes talk about what could happen, like Cornell was mentioning, what could happen. And sort of this time, preemptive legal strategies have been used for very right-leaning strategies that I'm not in agreement with. But, I think we're in a really messy and intertwined system. And we have laws and legal systems that are just like not great. They're just set up to perpetuate harm and to put people in danger in a lot of ways. And so, while I do believe that, our First Amendment right and free speech is super important, does it also mean that, we should be able to discriminate based on any protected class or our identity? No, right? And so this is a difficult case, and it definitely has difficult implications, like Cornell was mentioning, for the future and for what it means folks will try to do with this precedent. It's just we're in a really, really messy situation. And if we all had really kind hearts and were prioritizing inclusive excellence, we'd be okay. We'd be fine. But because there are folks who are using any tool to accomplish the task of inequity and oppression, we're in a dangerous place. We're in a really dangerous place, right? Free speech works really, really well when everyone has the intentions for good speech. But when people have intentions for bad and harmful speech, free speech is hard.
Yeah. And I feel like so something that we see happen a lot when people take up opposing viewpoints, positions against each other, is very quickly people start to dehumanize one another. Right. And I bring this into the conversation because dehumanization is the very first step towards enacting violence against one another. So as much as possible, as we're out here seeing these things unfold, it's really easy to get angry and to denigrate other people, other groups of people, to ultimately dehumanize them. But I'm going to urge everybody to resist that, right? To remember that these are human beings, that they are perhaps operating under faulty premises, biases, all these different cognitive traps that we can fall into. But if we start from a place of dehumanization, then how much can we actually expect people who have those opposing viewpoints to also see us as human, which is ultimately what we're driving toward, right? So we've got a couple comments coming in. Elena is back in her comments saying, it's already happening in my small town. A hair salon made it real clear we're not welcome there, and they are proud of it because they feel it's legal now. Yeah. So when something is, deemed legal or illegal, that's often very attached to how people feel about certain things. So it can embolden people. Thank you, Elena, for that. We also have some theme songs coming in from our audience questions. So Linessa Fraser says, "You're so vain." That would be the theme song of this trio of SCOTUS rulings. Elena again says, "Cruel Summer" would be her theme song for these three. And our friend Abiola Bala says, "Chain of Fools." So I like that one. Quentin's back again and saying, and it is important to hold people accountable without dehumanizing. We have to keep to accountability. Thoughts on this? Like, how do we proceed from the accountability perspective in the wake of these rulings?
I think we have to have a conversation around what accountability is. I think that accountability in the organizational space is oftentimes only seen as a punitive, we're going to fire people. We're going to put you on the front cover of Time magazine and walk you through the streets yelling shame, shame with the A written across your chest. And I feel like that's literally, in my years of doing workshops and talking about this, that is the image that comes up for people. And so we stay away from it because of, people are human and they make mistakes and we don't want to shame them and ruin their careers. And I'm not saying that is what we should always be doing. Am I saying that it is a tool in my toolbox? Absolutely. Right? Because there are certain things, certain actions and behaviors that, yes, I do want your career to be over. I don't want you to have the authority to be able to, police people, to teach children, to be in the classroom, etc. But I don't think it has to be. I think there's a spectrum of accountability, and so accountability is holding someone being answerable to someone else. And as human beings, we are all answerable to someone else. We are in various different relationships and roles in which we are answerable. I'm answerable to my bank to pay this mortgage. I'm answerable, right, to my neighbors to have my lawn mowed and make sure that there's not trash, right? We're all answerable to someone. And I think that, the problem is that when I don't deem you as someone who has the authority to hold me accountable, that becomes a big problem. So accountability for me, what it can look like, again, it can look like saying, hey, this may not be the organization for you, right? Because you're not living up to our value and our expectations of what a name, company, employee, represents. There's a myriad of ways and ways I can't describe in the next 8 minutes that we have here. I think we have to have a hard conversation about what accountability is and the multitude of ways of what it looks like. What I do know is that it is the missing component to all of this, because we're put in policies, we put in these rules, we have these company handbooks that says this is how you perform, but then someone goes the opposite direction of what we said they should do, and we do nothing to hold them accountable for it, which tells them, oh, y'all don't really care about this because I actually did that and you did nothing to me, right?
Yeah.
And so we can't do that. So I'll stop there. This is a topic I can talk about all day.
Cornell, I wonder if you saw this in the news. Like, Cornell and I live in the same kind of broad region, but I live in Oakland, and there was a situation where there was a man who's very agitated, and he had a gun, and the police came, right? And they were telling him to put the gun down. He wouldn't do it, right? And it was a complete standoff. However, somebody called the man's mother, and the mother showed up, and immediately he dropped the gun and, just left peaceably. Right. So he's accountable to her. Right. There's very few of us who are. I mean, I'm accountable to my mom. I can't even. I don't know where she is right now, what she's doing, but
well, right. He acknowledged her as a figure of like, yes, I respect this person. But I think also comes down to amount of respect and how we also see ourselves, right? Like, as a director of equity and belonging, any senior leader I've ever worked with who's above me doesn't see me as an accountable figure for them, right? They see themselves as my accountability figure. So how do we have that conversation within these organizations of who has the power to hold people accountable and make sure that they do the things we said that they should do in order to make this the culture that we want to make?
I like this conversation a lot, and I see Kat Adams's comment in the chat talking about personal accountability, but I'm also thinking about institutional accountability, right? And I just recently saw in the New York Times that Wesleyan University is ending their legacy admissions. So in light of affirmative action being struck down, institutions need to look at their other policies and say, well, hey, when this institution was founded, Harvard in 1636, and many institutions, or every institution after that, were Black folks even allowed to be in this school, right? Or were, unfortunately, they enslaved or otherwise, put behind these structural barriers and systems of oppression, right? And so we need to look at the systems that are happening around us, and institutions need to look at the systems happening within their space to ensure they're being responsive to all that's going on.
Yeah, for sure. I think we've got just under 5 minutes left. So I'd love to ask you all. So as DEI professionals or subject matter experts, what can people in our field be doing to better lead the conversation around what comes next for DEI and social justice?
I had thoughts, but I'll let someone else go first.
Let's start with you, Dani.
I would probably say, first and foremost, take care of yourselves and your mental health. I think that there is a lot going on, and we were talking about community and the lack thereof just a couple of minutes ago. So I would say, first and foremost, take care of yourself. The work will still be there. We have so much more work to do. The work will be there next month, next year, the next decade. So take care of yourself, and we'll be here.
Plus one to that 100%. I think self-care is the first step. I think the other thing is that we have to be prepared. I think we have to not wait for our senior leaders within our organizations to come to us to ask about the implications. I think we have to get ready right now. We have to develop our, research paper that outlines the ways in which it, all of these rulings impact us as an industry, but also how it impacts my organization specifically and the unique context in which I sit in. So I think the more we can prepare ourselves with the knowledge of what these rulings are, what they mean, and how they're being implemented, and the myriad of ways in which they could be have implications for us as whatever industry you're in, I think will be important. And so, as I always say about Beyonce concerts, if you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready, right? Right. So be proactive. Don't wait until the problems gets to our doorstep to start talking about it. We should be going to our leaders now to say, hey, are we having these conversations around the implications of these rulings for us? And are we prepared? Do we have the right systems and processes and culture in place in order to live the values that we say that we have?
Yeah, I'll add, and this is really just underscoring what's already been said. Be gentle with yourself, right? There are so many things that could be incredibly discouraging right now, but hopefully we are banding together and finding ways to be resilient within ourselves, within our communities, to find, individual care, but then also community care to reinforce ourselves, right? I think it's going to be important for us to have micro communities of hope and resiliency, especially in light of national and federal rolling backs of rights, right? Rights across the board for women and gender expansive folks, for queer folks, for Black and brown folks, right? We are seeing a rolling back of a number of laws of the land. And so we need to find our micro communities to stay resilient.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, on that note, I think the internet will continue to be a very instrumental tool for all of us within this work. But as things are getting a little bit safer and opening up a bit more, I do encourage people to get out there and, activate those social skills again, maybe get a drink with somebody, maybe have a meal, right? But there's something about that face-to-face connection that's something that we're adapted for, right? That's something that we've evolved for. This is all still a very new paradigm. So let's try to activate some of the things that feed into making us human, right? But the point is, the density of connections that we can weave together is something that's going to help us continue to be resilient, right? And if we're not taking care of ourselves, then of course we can't take care of others. So I just encourage everybody to try to do that. So we've got just a few seconds left, but I'd love to hear some closing thoughts from each of you. Dani, let's start with you, and then we'll move to Cornell, and then Jake.
So the one thing that I would say is, and we talked about this multiple times throughout our conversation, is yes, these rulings they are tough and they're discouraging, but there is a lot of work that we can still do, and there is a lot of work that we can do to help our leaders to actually see what's going to happen in the future, not only what's happening now, and that's probably where we need to focus our attention right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Plus one to that, I think I would say is reach back into history when you're sort of feeling really like, giving up and just feeling like there's just, we're never going to fix this. I think we got to reach back to the folks who came before us and read what they wrote to remind us of the path forward, to remind us of why this is important, to find that source of strength. I oftentimes will go back and read Audre Lorde, we'll go back and read Maya Angelou, we'll go back and read Toni Morrison and read all the greats that we're doing this work in their way, to find my source of like, yeah, I'm coming back to this work and I'm renewed. So that just I think hitting on that self-care piece one more time, because we're no good. Tabitha Brown, who I love, talks about filling your cup. Right? If your cup's not filled, then you can't do the work, right? What's in the cup is for you. The overflow is for everybody else.
Jake?
I'll say, find your sphere of influence, like we were talking about before, and build up whatever your platform is. And that platform can be, on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. It can also just be within your family, within your friend group. I don't think there's any more time for anyone to be politically or socially disengaged. I think all of us have a duty to be engaged. That doesn't mean we have to be always on, but we need to know what's going on. And so let's all rise to the duty to respond to the disenfranchisement we're seeing across the board. And it doesn't mean leading every rally in your city or town. It doesn't mean showing up for every cause every day. If you're able to, give what you can. But when you need to step back, know that you can as well. Again, I couldn't underscore enough just finding that community. For me, it is the education space. Educators need to come together and figure out how we're going to respond to this affirmative action ruling. But also students need to respond to, and folks who, I am encouraged by, I have 3 young nephews and a niece. The 3 nephews will be young Black men applying to college at one day in the future. And so my goal is to make the education landscape more habitable for them. I got about 10 years. The oldest one's 9 years old. And so there's work in front of us, and we have to band together to do it.
Well, fingers crossed. Dani, if people are interested in following you or reaching out to you, where can they get in touch?
Find me on LinkedIn, and you'll see it in there on the screen.
Also, I should mention that on LinkedIn, Dani has developed the hashtag DEI by Dani, and she's got really great content that comes out. I'll share that I was interviewing for jobs recently, and just before that, she released this checklist of questions that you should ask your interviewer, and I use it extensively. So I encourage you very much to follow her. And Dr. Verdeja-Woodson, as I have the pleasure of calling you now, if people are interested in finding you or contacting you, in fact, people are already asking in the comments, I don't know if you've seen, but where can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm also on what is now, I guess, called X now, not Twitter. I don't know. At Nelly GD. You can also find me on Instagram at It's Me Cornell. But LinkedIn is probably the most prominent way to find me. Cornell Verdeja-Woodson.
Great. And Jake, same question.
Yeah, for sure. I'm most active on LinkedIn as well. You can type in Jake Small. You'll know it's me. I'll have the queer flag next to my name. Or you can find me at I'm Jake Small or I'mJakeSmall.com on most platforms.
And just a note about how Jake likes to style his name. He does feel affirmed when people do capitalize all the letters of his first name in Jake, which is something that I think is great, and it definitely makes him stand out. So thank you all so much to our wonderful guests and to our wonderful audience. I'm blown away by the response every time. But, I'm just so glad to be in community with all of you, and hopefully we can make great things happen. So once again, this is Enrico Imanalo for the DEI is podcast. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.